This is the Authentic Change Podcast, and I am Mike Horne. Authenticity reflects what we want from each other and our organizations: open communication, trust, community, fun, and opportunity. I want to help you to do your best in your personal and professional relationships. This podcast delivers expertise, insights, and approaches on authentic leadership, to live your purpose, to lead from your values, to establish connected relationships, to steward people and culture change, to build and sustain prosperity, and to open doors and possibilities. This podcast will assist you in paving the way forward to personal, team, and organizational prosperity.
Welcome to another edition of the Authentic Change Podcast. I am delighted today to have as our guest Laurel Donnellan. And I hope I got that right, Laurel. I even practiced, but I'm not sure. So I'll let you do that justice in just a moment. Laurel is the founder and a podcaster at the Compassionate Leaders Circle and a leadership contributor at Forbes.com. She hails, and I think this place has a central part in her life, from the small amount I know about Laurel, from Sag Harbor, New York. And Laurel, I'm just delighted to have you today as a guest on our podcast. Would you do a little bit more introduction of yourself and the correct pronunciation of your surname? Thank you.
Well, you did a great job. We say Donnellan, and I'm in Sag Harbor, New York, and I'm so happy to be with you.
Tell me, how did the Compassionate Leaders Circle come about? What's the origin story there?
Well, I've been doing change work with executives and individuals and organizations a long time. I would say about 30 years. And most of that work was done with consumers, and I did some writing. 3 years ago, I was looking at my 60th birthday coming around the corner, and I was thinking about my last career chapter, and I wanted to make more of an impact. So I founded the Compassionate Leaders Circle to leverage all the change models I've developed over the years, but also bring in more people. We have our podcast, we have our Forbes. So we're a media company and an education company. And I started the company in January of 2019. And last year was a blur, but everything's looking pretty positive and fantastic for growth in the future. I think now more than ever, it's a time to lead with love and be more authentic about that.
Compassion is a very specific word.
It is. I think a lot about it. Yes.
What are you thinking about compassion, Laurel?
Well, I've done a lot of reading of other people's research. The definition we use in our programs is compassion is preventing or alleviating suffering. And when we talk about compassion, we're talking about the people and the planet. As I grow older, I think it's great to have great, authentic relationships, but if we don't have a place to live like the earth, it's all for naught. So
it's an interesting construction. It's a Buddhist construction, right? The elimination of suffering. One of my teachers, he often described coaching. This is Bob Keegan, the Immunity to Change model. I studied with Bob and Lisa Leahy. And Bob described coaching as the elimination of some suffering. I've come to think about it differently, but I think about it as bringing on some happiness, about introducing a happiness. And maybe they are just different sides of the same coin, a way of looking at it. But I have pondered that for some time, particularly as it relates to the concepts of authenticity, right? Because as I understand it all, and based on what I've experienced in coaching others and consulting with leaders, is that authentic people are generally happy people because they are congruent, right? Their words and their actions match. And even better when, their thoughts align with their words and actions, right? And you have sort of attitudinal, behavioral, cognitive congruence, makes for a happy person generally. And what we know about the world of work too, however that, forms for people now, is that people like working with happy people. And generally, this is how I want to tie this to compassion. And generally, what we know is that, when happy people work together, they're able to produce more, do better, bring more of who they are to what they do. And I think that all grows out of a set of humanistic values. And help me, this is where I need some help with compassion. I get confused. Is it a value? Is it an emotion? Is it a feeling? Is it all of that?
I love this conversation. I'm so happy we're in it. So we talk about compassion being action. So, and yes, it can be a feeling. It can be a value, certainly. Mm-hmm. But I'm about change. And when I work with people, individuals, organizations, we want to really focus in on action. So identifying ways we can help you prevent and alleviate suffering for yourself, for others, for the planet.
It's so wonderful to think about it or construct it as a verb. So often when I think about the concepts of integrity and authenticity, I mean, they are something that we often hold out there as objects, but the foundation of both is trust, as it is so many things, right? And what we know, I think what we know, at least as I've experienced and I've heard others express it, that when you don't trust a person, you don't think they have integrity. And when you don't think somebody has integrity, you don't trust them. So it's really at the foundation of what we describe in authentic interactions with each other, right? That it forms on some basis of trust. And I love how you illustrate that concept of compassion, maybe really taking it in an action step. So maybe it is an expression of some value.
Yeah. Well, coincidentally, but maybe not so coincidentally, I have a process we bring individuals through called the Donnellan method. And we do have two values in there that are associated with actions. And one is authenticity and one is integrity. And the actions we associate with authenticity is knowing and developing your passions. And integrity is like claiming a purpose, right? So I think it's hard to be authentic if you don't know yourself and you don't know what turns you on, what ignites you. And it's hard to have integrity if you don't know what you stand for.
Sure. Self-awareness is at a core to all of this, that you have to accept where you are in order to change, right? That's a Jungian observation. Another one is that the gift of a lifetime is becoming the person you are. And if you can do that by eliminating some suffering, and I might think of suffering as another construction of just less, even though often less is more. But sometimes, well, maybe that is a relevant topic here as well, is that how do you lessen burden, stress? That's how we act with compassion. Is that right, Laurel?
Okay. So when I think about less or enough, I think about a lot of my clients are suffering from feeling like there's not enough time, there's not enough money, there's not enough options, there's not enough resources. And so I really like this idea of compassion and less. That's a really interesting concept to play around with.
Mhm. I would think that as you begin to lead compassionately, to use compassion as a way of action, that it's helpful to identify what concerns you or what worries you have. And maybe that as some sort of starting point. Bob Keegan used to call it the worry box, identifying your worry box.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start with a client or yourself, right? What am I worried about? And I also bring in, when we're working with organizations, we talk about 3 types of compassion that have to exist to have a compassionate culture. And this can apply to a community, a church, an organization, a family. So the 3 things are self-compassion, which I'm having lots of conversations with leaders right now about taking a breath and being kinder to themselves, especially like emotionally and mentally, not beating themselves up so much. Then there's vulnerability. So there's self-compassion, there's vulnerability. It's hard to have a compassionate culture if you don't know where the suffering is. So leaders, peers, stakeholders have to have a community where they can talk about where they're suffering or where they need help or what's really going on. And then the last type of compassion is compassion for others. And when I work with organizations or individuals, I talk about them being dials, because sometimes you're so dialed into compassion for others, you're not asking for help, or you're not being kind to yourself. So usually you can look at those 3 things and create more balance by thinking about what you need to dial down and what you need to dial up. So do I need to be more vulnerable? Do I need to be more compassionate to others? Do I need to be more self-compassionate? And where may I be overusing compassion? Maybe I'm so focused on helping others, I'm not taking care of myself, for instance.
Right. That's an interesting observation. And do you see that in clients at times? I mean, and how does that manifest in terms of leadership?
Well, lately, most of the patterns have been, especially because everyone's been in a crisis or continues to be in a crisis, that the people that are still standing and still have organizations are they've been so others focused that, generally speaking, they're not asking for enough help and they're not being kind to themselves. So that's what I see showing up right now. But I've also seen it, where leaders are so focused on themselves, they're not aware of the suffering that's going on with their team.
Right. I think that suffering is a big word. Could I describe it as a heavy word? And I wonder if there's other language in corporate speak that some have been accustomed to or grown accustomed to, such a maybe the expression pain points or
Yeah, I think opportunities for growth, pain points, blind spots. But I actually like having discussions about suffering because I want to help leaders think about their larger community beyond the walls of their organization and think about food scarcity and climate change and real suffering beyond the walls of the organization. So I like talking about suffering, even if it's a heavy word, because I feel like we all need to wake up.
Yes, and it's challenging, I think, in cultures where there are so many managers who convey an everything's fine approach because of they're just so uncertain about it. And I don't know, but I think that one of our key growth skills, in addition to our ability to learn, is to look less for certainty, which is what all the data analysts give us, and to embrace uncertainty as sort of the new career development skill. Individuals who are able to demonstrate their ability to do that. I bet compassion helps a long way in that way of thinking.
I love your word authentic too, because you can't be authentic and say everything is fine.
Right. Right.
And there are cultures where that's the norm. Everything's fine. And I'm seeing, I work with not-for-profits. I work with large businesses. I look for small businesses, and I see this everything's fine turning into a volcano that's erupting now.
Sure.
And if you can start with, I need help, or as a leader, you can say, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I think over being authentic and being truthful. I have a mentor long ago told me, if you're making everyone happy, you're not telling the truth.
Mm.
And,
well, yeah. And then the way that I think about it was from my earliest mentor, Warren Bennis, who said, if it can't be found out, it will be found out. That is the truth in organization. I mean, there really aren't such things as organizational secrets.
Yeah. Ken Blanchard used to talk about putting things in your backpack. You just put it in your backpack. Eventually the backpack's going to break and everything's going to come tumbling out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what I think we know, and is now the conventional wisdom, is that the cover up is always more difficult. Saying I need help, I made a mistake, I screwed up here, I really learned a lot. Maybe I didn't. I'm sorry I overlooked this. I'm sorry I wasn't inclusive enough of ideas. All of the things that I would imagine go into a compassionate way of being.
Well, I think that's a good point, Mike, too, around speaking the truth sooner rather than later might be short-term pain, but alleviate suffering in the long term. And we want to prevent it as well as alleviate it.
So as you discuss compassion beyond, inside the individual, the team, the organization, and beyond those boundaries, what are the benefits that arise? Sure, we increase the value of our meaning, our contribution. What else might come to mind in terms of how clients become willing to commit to this kind of a process of change?
Well, I think we can lean into the evidence. So what's interesting is I talk about the scholars kept, catching up with the sages. So in the last 16 years or so, there's actually been a body of work created by scholars, primarily at business schools, that have found that there's an ROI to compassion. I have a list of books I recently published at Forbes called the Love List. I think it's 12 books that are evidence-based books. So there's a lot of, and we use this evidence when we bring it to organizations to help people take a bigger leap. But there's evidence that all three of these types of compassion, self-compassion, vulnerability, and compassion for others, improves employee and customer retention over the long term, and improves innovation over the long term. There's teamwork. There's lots profitability. There's lots of beautiful things that have been proven from the process of creating a compassionate culture and a compassionate team and a compassionate individual.
Sure. And I would imagine those outcomes are byproducts of what happens between and among people who are in those groups and those who work in teams or other organizational units or variables. Well, so what are some of the key lessons that you share with others about compassion, Laurel?
Well, my favorite one that's emerged over the last year, because I'm still a student, because I've I've focused in on compassion over the last 3 years, and I interview other people and learn from scholars about it. But one of the best lessons I got from a colleague whose name is Uvini Lubecki, and she has a company that helps people with compassion. That compassion can be fierce or gentle. I think the resistance sometimes in organizations is, oh, that's another soft skill. I don't need another soft skill.
Right.
But compassion can be fierce. And if you're in a crisis, for instance, I think we're looking at a lot of CEOs deciding how to react to the variant. And some of them are being pretty fierce about masks and vaccinations and testing. And that's an example of preventing suffering by, making some tough decisions in the short term. So compassion can be fierce or soft, or fierce or gentle is a main lesson. Compassion can be learned. You don't have to be born compassionate. It's absolutely been proven that it's a skill that can be learned. And I think it's a lifetime journey to develop those skills of self-compassion, vulnerability, and compassion for others. So those are a few of my favorite lessons on compassion.
And when you see those embodied in people, so we know that some of the suffering has gone away, it's dissipated, what do you see in the person or the group? I know you see all these wonderful outcomes in terms of ROI and productivity and innovation increases, but what do you experience? Well, how do individuals describe their life in compassion?
Well, I can best describe it for myself.
Wonderful.
It's an embodied experience.
Yes.
So it can, and I named my company Compassionate Leaders Circle. So one of the things that has happened over the last 3 years is my bar for being a compassionate leader is risen. Because I want to practice what I preach, and it's really hard. It's really hard. And I can, share an example. I turned 61 this year. Last year was very tough on me personally, physically, emotionally, financially. Mm-hmm. And as an act of self-compassion, I now work 4 days a week, and I have 7 weeks of vacation this year. And the result is my company's doing better financially than it's ever done, but it is much better for my staff to have a rested and present and happy leader. So that's an example of compassion. And, I was just in a meeting earlier with my new chief marketing officer, and I really want to impress her and have everything together for her. And I had to sort of cop to, well, this is unusual, but I worked until 10 o'clock last night. So I don't have everything together for you. And we didn't have to spend the whole meeting on it. But I think being vulnerable and sharing with her what's really going on. And then she was able to share what's really going on with her family. And it just helped us have a very meaningful and deep and authentic meeting.
Sure. And maybe one of my takeaways among many from today's conversation is that by eliminating or reducing suffering, you foster happiness. And isn't
Absolutely.
that's the goal that we have, or the relationship, at least as I begin to understand between compassion and authenticity, and how that becomes part of who we are and our expression of that in our interactions with others and in groups.
Yeah, and I think I love happiness, and the happier I am, it makes ripple effects, right? So the happier my team is, that affects their families, that affects our clients. There's all these ripple effects. And I also want to share one thing about compassion for others. I think as a trained coach, and I went to the Hudson Institute.
Oh, sure. Frederick Hudson,
yeah.
and was brilliant.
I really enjoyed him and still enjoy his wife.
Yes.
So I think as I was trained as a coach, there was a lot of talk about boundaries and, making sure that if I wasn't an expert, you'd, refer people to other resources. But playing with compassion in my executive coaching practice, I find myself taking more actions, especially when people are in crisis. So as you know, like sometimes we're working with someone on executive coaching and then an illness arises or they need marital support.
Sure.
And what I've found is I happen to enjoy finding resources for people. So I think we're in the past, before my compassion chapter, I would have been, here's some referrals or you need to go get other help. I'm more active in helping that person find help because often they're in a crisis. And when you're in a crisis, it's hard to even know the type of help you need. So I find myself leaning in more and taking more action short term. And then long term, they get help faster and I have less worry about them. So in the end, there's an ROI.
Yes, to explore and to open doors. Yes. Absolutely amazing, Laurel Donnellan, what you're doing with the compassion in the workplace and for the planet itself. And I was wondering if our listeners wanted to get in touch with your firm, what are the ways to visit your company, the Compassionate Leader Circle? Thank you.
So they can be in touch with me directly at Laurel@CompassionateLeadersCircle.com. They can go to our website, CompassionateLeadersCircle.com, or they can see our podcast anywhere podcasts are downloaded. It's called the Compassionate Leader Circle Podcast.
Oh, that's great. So I think Compassionate Leader Circle in a search bar should turn up a way to
hopefully I'll pop up.
Okay, that's it. But if it's not, it's CompassionateLeadersCircle.com.
Correct.
As a way of getting in touch. That's great. This has been just a fascinating and enjoyable conversation and discussion for me, Laurel, and I'm taking away from it lots of insights into authenticity and integrity and about being in the world and being happy in the world and understanding that reducing suffering has a relationship to increasing happiness. And I just want to thank you for all of the work that you're doing with others in this regard and to thank you for spending time with our audience today. Thank you, Laurel.
It was a great honor. Thank you, Mike.
Thanks. And to everyone, please tune into the next episode of Authentic Change. It'll be out there in a week and enjoy at your pleasure. Thanks again, everyone.
Thanks for listening. And I hope you'll subscribe today and tell a friend about our show. If you're looking for hands-on help to increase your success through authentic change or have a question you'd like to hear me answer here, please email me at mike@mike-horne.com.